Well, what we were talking about was actually a real live situation that I was involved with for the last few years down in this area. They got some government funding, and so I'm allowed to speak about it in general terms, although not specifics to their circumstance. But essentially, it was bringing together 4 very large farms that were totally economic units on their own and combining their operations in a way that they could still own their own land, and yet they could farm together and get all the economies of scale and the benefit thereof. And really, farmers have tried to sort of do this, get the economies of scale. Sometimes they're doing bulk buying, where they go in and all buy fertilizer together, or they do a machinery co-op deal where, okay, I'll buy a bigger combine than I need. Perhaps you'll buy a bigger tractor, and we'll swap machinery. But all those things either have limits if it's bulk buying, or issues, because if I own the combine and both of our fields are ready to harvest, well, who do I want to do? I want to do my field, and then the neighbor we can do his next. And those create issues, so the whole thing was trying to come up with a structure that took away some of those issues and yet got the benefits. And we looked at different structures, and one we looked at was a partnership, but there was some issues there with getting access to the low rate of tax that most farm companies are allowed to get. So again, benefit of the joint venture structure was the ability to make sure they each got their full access to the low rate of tax that's available for corporate farms, and that was definitely a benefit of the structure as it worked out. Well, major benefits are the size in terms of, if you're going into an equipment dealer and you're replacing 4 or 5 combines as opposed to 1, clearly there's going to be a purchase price difference for you when you go in to make those kinds of acquisitions. That's a major benefit, and that applies across the board. It doesn't matter if you're buying chemical, fertilizer, fuel, whatever. If you're buying in much bigger quantities, you're going to get that benefit. It also, though, met the needs of the parties, I think, because we had a pretty wide age range. So, from late 30s to early 60s, and so it allows the fellow in particular that was the upper end to sort of back away from the farm in terms of day-to-day operations, and yet really still be engaged in the farming business, which was really what he wanted. So it kind of met a multiple set of objectives, I think. It probably was close to 2 years process from when they started trying to look at ways to put this together to actually get it in place and get an agreement. So we ended up with each of the farmers meeting their objective of keeping their own land in their own ownership, but everything else went into either a joint venture that actually is carrying on the farming operation on all the lands, or it went into a new company which primarily owned the equipment that was going to be used by the joint venture. So we tried to come up with something that was tax effective, yet not an administrative nightmare in terms of bookkeeping and record keeping. The very hardest issue was definitely the income allocation, because we have this joint venture that's earning this profit. Well, how much should each of them be entitled to? Yeah, it's an internal thing. I mean, in general terms, what they did was they effectively said, okay, the first so much of their income will allocate almost like it was rent on the land. So in other words, if I brought so many acres to the party, I would get an initial return that kind of equated to rent. So at least I could be comfortable, I got some return on my land. And then the rest was an allocation based on a number of other factors. Things like one of them produced a special crop, which currently was making, I'll call it a super profit because it was a specialized crop. So maybe I get a little extra allocation because I'm bringing that expertise for that crop to the table for the first 3 or 4 years. The other thing it did was it came up with salaries for those that were actually working. So for example, the farmer that was really not wanting to be day-to-day involved wasn't getting a salary, whereas the fellow that took on the CEO responsibility was getting paid a salary for the work that was being done as well. So, as I said, kind of rewarded those that really wanted to be there day to day, and yet took the burden off those that didn't want to sell out, but didn't want to have to be there every day. Played out really well. They've been in operation now, I think it's in their 6th year, and they're thrilled. They're still all together and still going hard. It's the first one I'm aware of in Western Canada that's done this type of thing in terms of working together. So, they were fortunate, I think, that commodity prices and all that were good. That helped make it work, I think, really well. But I think they've seen the benefits that even if commodity prices back off and they don't have as good of years, they see the benefits of the structure and of working together. Well, I think the questions were mainly about, okay, if we can come up with a way to figure out how we're going to allocate it, what business structure allows us to do that and to change it from year to year? I mean, if, for example, we were limited to using a company, well, that becomes pretty tough to change percentages from year to year without a major hassle. Nice thing about a joint venture is if we agree to change it completely next year in terms of how the income's allocated, all we have to do is agree to make that happen, and it happens without spending a bunch of money reorganizing the joint venture as you would be required to do for a company. Well, I think really two main things. The one thing was the structure that we ended up with, which was, as you mentioned, a joint venture and a new limited company on top of the companies they already had, and the reasons why tax and business-wise that made sense. But I think almost as importantly, tried to get the sense of the people and the communication and all the issues of coming up with something that worked for everybody, the give and take, and the fact that, in my view, the structure is great, but you got to have the right people to make it work. You know, when you're negotiating things like income allocation, if you're the kind of person that has to get the last penny that's there, it's not really conducive to having a good long-term relationship. So, you know, I kind of look at it as negotiation for those kinds of things is we both walk away from the table feeling like we left something on the table and feel good about that, and that's the kind of personalities you need to make something like this work, in my view.